Something has shifted, not loudly, not in the streets or on the news, not with guns or protests, but quietly, internally. A revolution that has slipped beneath the skin of society, so subtle it barely left a trace, yet so profound it may change the very soul of human connection. Look around. Power is everywhere. The woman in the boardroom with eyes that don't blink. The influencer commanding millions with a filtered smile. The politician with a perfect soundbite. Not a single second of silence, not a flicker of doubt. Authority is the new intimacy. Control is the new vulnerability. And love is outdated, inconvenient, an interruption. We live in an era where empowerment is currency, and the chase for dominance is dressed in high heels and confidence quotes. Ambition is divine, and to serve anyone but yourself is heresy. But what if beneath the glow of neon feminism and digital identity, something darker is at play? More than a century ago, one man saw it coming, Friedrich Nietzsche, the brooding German philosopher, misunderstood by both his critics and admirers, warned not against women, but against something far more disturbing. He warned of what happens when anyone, but especially women, once the emotional bedrock of relational life, begin to pursue power not as balance, but as conquest, not as integration, but as escape. He wasn't moralizing, he wasn't politicking, he was observing, diagnosing, foreseeing, because Nietzsche didn't fear powerful women. He feared what happens to the world when power becomes more desirable than love, when domination is glorified and surrender is equated with weakness, when the relational feminine, whether in women or in culture, is disfigured by the relentless hunger of the ego. He saw the signs: rising nihilism, spiritual emptiness, the collapse of traditional values. But more than that, he saw the psychological consequences of a culture that worships the self and sterilizes connection. When power is everything, love becomes nothing. And now, here we are. Our world is run by identities instead of souls, platforms instead of conversations, digital masks instead of emotional skin, and underneath it all, loneliness, profound, aching loneliness. So we ask the question, what did Nietzsche really warn us about? This isn't about feminism or patriarchy, right or left. This is about a war inside the psyche, a shift in how we define meaning, self-worth, and fulfillment. This is not a sermon, it's not a manifesto, it's an autopsy, a slow descent into the forgotten parts of ourselves, where love used to live. The silent revolution isn't over. It's just begun. And if we don't understand what Nietzsche was really trying to say, we won't just lose love, we'll lose ourselves. Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most polarizing thinkers in modern philosophy. To some, he's a nihilistic madman. To others, a prophet of psychological truth. And to many, he's simply unreadable, too cryptic, too intense, too dangerous. But perhaps no aspect of his writing has generated more controversy than his views on women. At first glance, they're hard to defend. In Beyond Good and Evil, he wrote, "You are going to women, do not forget the whip." In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he claimed that women are often incapable of friendship, only love. In The Gay Science, he joked that women were still cats, birds, or at best cows. These statements seem damning, but were they? Or was Nietzsche doing something far more subtle than crude misogyny? Something almost no one is willing to understand today. To begin, Nietzsche did not write philosophy as a list of bullet points or moral guidelines. He wrote as a dramatist, as a provocateur. He often employed hyperbole, irony, and poetic metaphor to challenge lazy assumptions and awaken the deeper instincts of the reader. You don't read Nietzsche for agreement. You read him for confrontation. His statements about women were no exception. When Nietzsche spoke of women, he was rarely speaking only about literal women. He was exploring what he saw as the feminine principle in human psychology: the emotional, the intuitive, the relational, the seductive. And more importantly, he was questioning what happens when that principle is corrupted by the pursuit of power. Nietzsche's concern wasn't women rising in society. It wasn't independence, education, or equality. It was spiritual displacement, a disconnection from what he believed was the core strength of femininity, the capacity to love, to receive, to bind relationships through emotional power, not brute force or domination. In Nietzsche's metaphysics, the world is shaped by a single driving force: the will to power. Every living thing wants to grow, to assert, to overcome resistance. But Nietzsche was careful to draw a line between power as vitality and power as possession, between becoming and controlling. He observed that in modern culture, especially as Christianity declined, this will to power would take over every domain of life, not just in men, but in women. And when this force is no longer grounded in inner truth, it becomes hollow, performative, mechanical. For Nietzsche, the rise of the power-hungry individual, male or female, was a symptom of deep existential sickness. When people, in search of identity, begin to imitate structures of dominance, rather than cultivate their own nature, they lose authenticity. And authenticity was everything to Nietzsche. So why did he focus so often on women? Because in his eyes, women represented the final frontier of the human soul, the last holdout of emotion, beauty, sensuality, vulnerability. Not because women are weaker, but because they were the ones keeping the human experience rooted in the depths of feeling and relationship. When this energy turns toward the chase for status, for control, for visibility, it signals not progress, but loss, not evolution, but fragmentation. Nietzsche saw early signs of this in his own time. The industrial world was erasing softness. Women were being pushed into masculine molds, not by natural evolution, but by cultural imitation. And as this occurred, something precious was being traded: the soul's balance between power and love. The tragedy, in Nietzsche's view, was not that women would become more powerful, but that they would become more like men in their vices, not their virtues. That the feminine would be forced to wear the mask of the masculine in order to survive a world drunk on conquest. And the deeper danger, that men, in turn, would lose the mirror that called them to something higher. That both sexes would spiral into rivalry instead of harmony, into performance instead of presence. His warnings weren't gender attacks, they were spiritual alarms. Nietzsche never said women shouldn't be strong. He never claimed they lacked intelligence, insight, or agency. What he feared was a culture that no longer valued the strength and softness, the kind of power that doesn't need to dominate to transform. He feared what happens when love becomes a liability and emotional intelligence becomes a joke. So, while many of Nietzsche's phrases appear offensive on the surface, they demand a deeper lens. They are symptoms of a mind that was not afraid to offend in the name of truth, a mind that saw the psychological cost of a society obsessed with surfaces, with roles, with domination disguised as progress. Today, many dismiss Nietzsche as archaic, even hateful. But perhaps the real tragedy is that so few are willing to ask what he was really pointing at. Because if we read him not as a moralist, but as a psychologist, the picture changes. Nietzsche didn't hate women. He hated pretense. He hated imitation. He hated the flattening of the human experience into mechanistic categories and socially engineered scripts. He longed for a world where individuals, man or woman, were not defined by their conformity, but by their character, their inner fire, their refusal to wear costumes handed down by a culture addicted to manipulation. And for him, the erosion of the feminine wasn't just about gender, it was about the loss of the heart. In a world that runs on power, Nietzsche asked one question no one could answer. What happens when no one remembers how to love? Power, not just the kind etched into history books or worn like a title, but the silent kind, the inner kind, the kind that drives people to speak when they should listen, to control when they should connect, to climb when they should reflect. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power is one of his most misunderstood ideas. To many, it sounds like domination, conquest, superiority. But Nietzsche wasn't interested in mere control over others. He was obsessed with something deeper, the ability of the self to overcome its own limitations, to grow, to will oneself into becoming more. For Nietzsche, power was not about hierarchy. It was about transformation. But transformation without self-awareness becomes performance. It mutates into a mask. And this, he feared, is where civilization was headed. A place where everyone was performing power, but no one was becoming powerful. In this theater of appearances, both men and women are trapped. What Nietzsche saw in the emerging modern world was a culture where masculine traits, assertion, control, calculation, were being celebrated universally, while feminine traits, empathy, intuition, relational depth, were being discarded, not just by men, but by women too. This, to Nietzsche, was not progress. It was imbalance. It was the collapse of the psyche's inner architecture. Carl Jung would later build on this with his concepts of the anima and animus, the feminine soul within every man, the masculine spirit within every woman. In a healthy psyche, these forces collaborate. They form a bridge between reason and emotion, between strength and vulnerability. But when a person over-identifies with one pole, when the masculine dominates entirely, even in women, a spiritual distortion occurs. Power becomes hollow. Achievement becomes anxiety. Success becomes surveillance. This wasn't about gender, roles. It was about archetypal integration. Nietzsche wasn't criticizing women for becoming strong. He was warning what happens when strength is defined only in masculine terms: status, aggression, visibility, while emotional wisdom is dismissed as weakness. He had seen the prototype already: the modern man, disconnected from feeling, obsessed with utility, terrified of stillness. And now, he feared, women were being drawn into the same trap, not because they were weak, but because they were being taught to imitate a broken standard. In a society where image overrides essence, even empowerment becomes imitation. Today, we see it everywhere. Influencers building empires on hyper-curated personas, leaders with polished speeches but dead eyes, a generation addicted to productivity but starving for meaning. In the pursuit of dominance, we've traded depth for drama, connection for control, and Nietzsche's fear wasn't just philosophical, it was existential, because when people chase power without love, they begin to see others not as fellow souls, but as obstacles, tools, or threats. The relational self disintegrates. The world becomes a battlefield of egos, where intimacy is unsafe and authenticity is punished. We call this empowerment, but Nietzsche might have called it a quiet kind of slavery to the false self, to the endless need for validation, to the algorithmic approval of a culture that rewards the loudest voice, not the most grounded soul. What he wanted was not obedience to old roles, but a radical individuation, a psychological awakening where people didn't just inherit scripts, but wrote their own, with truth and fire. And that meant embracing the full spectrum of human nature, not just the masculine drive to act, but the feminine capacity to feel, not just to conquer the world, but to stay rooted in one's own being. The will to power, at its highest form, wasn't about becoming stronger than others. It was about becoming stronger than your false self. Nietzsche's real warning was this: if we forget how to love, if we abandon the relational for the mechanical, if we trade essence for image, then we don't become powerful. We become haunted by loneliness, by disconnection, by the ghosts of who we might have been. And it won't matter whether we call it empowerment, success, or revolution. If we lose our balance, we lose our humanity. Because in the end, power without love is just a performance, and no one is watching. History remembers powerful women in sharp silhouettes. They are queens, rulers, philosophers, revolutionaries. But behind each myth lies a psychological portrait, often torn between two fundamental human drives: the desire to connect and the desire to conquer. To Nietzsche, this conflict was not merely biographical, it was archetypal. It reflected a deeper struggle within the human soul, between eros and logos, love and will, depth and domination. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, remains one of history's most iconic figures. She was not simply a seductress, but a strategist, a diplomat, a linguist, fluent in a dozen tongues. Cleopatra wielded power with an intelligence that both fascinated and unnerved Rome's patriarchs. But what made her truly dangerous, in their eyes, was not just her ambition, it was her relational genius. She did not conquer men, she compelled them. She understood that influence wasn't just about status, it was about intimacy. Her liaisons with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not just political, they were emotional alliances, entangled in love, desire, and dreams of empire. Nietzsche might have seen Cleopatra as a rare example of balance, a woman who embodied eros even as she navigated the brutal world of politics. But even Cleopatra's story ends in tragedy. The death of Antony, the fall of her kingdom, her final act of suicide suggest a soul consumed not by power alone, but by its cost. She ruled as a goddess, but died as a woman, abandoned by both love and empire. Centuries later, a very different figure would rise, one who rejected the romantic entirely. Ayn Rand. Rand's legacy is fiercely polarizing. To some, she is a prophet of individualism. To others, a cold architect of greed. Her philosophy, objectivism, declared rational self-interest as the highest moral good. Emotions were to be managed, not trusted. Altruism was a vice. Dependency, emotional or financial, was weakness. Rand's personal life mirrored her ideas. She famously maintained an open affair with her much younger protege, Nathaniel Brandon, rationalizing it within her philosophical framework, even as it caused profound pain to those around her. To Nietzsche, Rand may have appeared as a distorted echo of his own thought. She spoke of strength, of rising above the herd, but her vision lacked the tragic depth that Nietzsche wove into his philosophy. Where Nietzsche understood the need for love, even in suffering, Rand seemed to eliminate it altogether. She didn't just challenge traditional love, she dismissed it as irrational, and in doing so, perhaps revealed the loneliness at the heart of her worldview. Catherine the Great offers a different lens, a German princess who overthrew her husband to become Empress of Russia. Catherine combined ruthlessness with Renaissance ambition. She corresponded with Voltaire, reformed laws, and expanded education. But she was also notorious for her lovers, many of whom she elevated to political power. For Catherine, love and power were tools, not opposites. She used both strategically. Yet here too, Nietzsche's shadow lingers. Catherine's reign was brilliant, but also marked by suspicion, betrayal, and deep emotional isolation. Her need for control over men, over court, over culture, became a fortress that few could penetrate. Love, in its raw form, was always filtered through political utility. And in that calculation, something essential was lost. Then comes Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, a woman who entered the highest echelons of British politics not by embracing femininity, but by outmasculinating the men around her. Stern, calculated, unyielding, Thatcher embodied a form of power Nietzsche might have seen as Nietzschean in its strength, but problematic in its suppression of the feminine. Thatcher rarely spoke of emotion. She disdained compromise. She prided herself on resolve. But those who knew her described a woman hardened by isolation. Her children once remarked how distant she became. In seeking power, she had to erase softness, not because she lacked it, but because the system she entered punished it. Power required performance, and performance demanded detachment. Nietzsche's concern wasn't about whether women could be powerful. It was about what kind of power we're teaching them to pursue. In a culture where emotional intelligence is dismissed, where relational wisdom is undervalued, those who seek influence are forced to adopt the armor of cold logic and ceaseless dominance. And over time, this isn't just a choice. It becomes a personality. Finally, we arrive in the modern era with Hillary Clinton. Few figures have embodied the gendered paradox of power more than her. Brilliant, ambitious, endlessly scrutinized, Clinton's political ascent was marked not only by her own efforts, but by the public's obsession with her emotional tone. She was criticized for being too cold, too calculating, then for being too emotional. Her relationship with Bill Clinton, her role in global politics, her failed presidential campaigns, all reveal a woman constantly caught between expectation and self-expression. Was she powerful? Undeniably. Was she loved? That remains more complicated. Her public image was never allowed to be fully human. She became a symbol, a vessel for the fears and projections of a society still confused about what it wants from powerful women. What unites all these figures? Cleopatra, Rand, Catherine, Thatcher, Clinton, is not just their influence, it's the cost of that influence. Each, in their own way, was forced to navigate a world where love and power are positioned as opposites, and each reveals a fragment of Nietzsche's warning. When power is pursued without emotional balance, it becomes brittle. It devours its wielder from within. Love, vulnerability, receptivity, these aren't signs of weakness. They are the counterweights to tyranny, the anchors of meaning in a world addicted to domination. Nietzsche never said women shouldn't be powerful. What he feared was the psychological consequence of being forced to choose between the soul's two halves, between eros and will, between softness and sovereignty. In chasing power alone, we don't just lose love, we lose ourselves. A young woman scrolls through her feed. It's filled with content that oscillates between empowerment and disconnection. One post preaches independence, the next flaunts vulnerability as a commodity. She sees messages like, "You don't need a man," "Secure the bag," "Love yourself first," and "Be his peace." Conflicting slogans for a conflicted soul. This is not a judgment. It is an observation of a cultural contradiction. We live in an era that has reframed strength, especially for women, once associated with care, community, and the capacity to create life. Strength is now increasingly measured by dominance, ambition, and self-sufficiency. The modern woman is told she can be anything: a CEO, a warrior, a mother, a muse, but also that she must be everything and all at once. Nietzsche would not have critiqued this shift as a misogynist. He would have critiqued it as a philosopher. He saw, long before our time, the psychological danger of living according to false virtues, especially when those virtues are defined not by what brings meaning, but by what maintains control. Power today is marketed as liberation. It is sold in hashtags, in brands, in influencer captions drenched in filtered solitude. The boss babe archetype has become a symbol of success. She is rich, admired, and untouched. But beneath the curated feeds and polished confidence lies something Nietzsche would have recognized, a soul estranged from its own inner life. Because here's the truth. Domination is not intimacy. Control is not connection. And endless self-promotion does not substitute for being deeply known by another human being. We are watching a subtle war unfold, not between men and women, but within individuals themselves. Nietzsche called this internal fracture a crisis of the soul, when the will to power overrides the will to meaning. In today's dating culture, this crisis manifests in the erosion of trust. Vulnerability has become a liability. To show emotion is to risk being labeled weak. To desire love is to appear needy. And so, both men and women armor themselves. The result? Hookup culture, swipe fatigue, situationships replacing relationships, desire decoupled from devotion. And yet, the numbers are revealing. Depression and anxiety rates, especially among young women, have skyrocketed. Loneliness, once an occasional shadow, has become a chronic state. Emotional burnout isn't just a workplace issue, it's a lifestyle. Behind the glamour of independence, there's a quiet scream for connection. But Nietzsche warned us, when love is devalued, we don't simply become free, we become fragmented. When the feminine principle, eros, nurturance, relational depth, is suppressed in favor of pure dominance, something essential is lost, not just in women, but in everyone. This isn't about going back to outdated gender roles. It's about moving forward with integrity, a society that honors only ambition while mocking affection breeds imbalance. Masculine and feminine aren't cages, they're polarities. They exist in everyone, regardless of gender, and when one side is rejected, the whole being suffers. Corporate feminism, for all its surface victories, has often replicated the very hierarchies it sought to dismantle. The boardroom replaced the bedroom, but the pressure remained. Be more, feel less, prove your worth, then repeat. But what happens when the very metrics of empowerment are built on masculine ideals of conquest? We tell women they must earn their place, climb the ranks, outperform the competition. But do we ever stop to ask, perform for whom? And at what cost? There's a reason burnout is especially high among high-achieving women, because the chase for external validation often runs counter to internal fulfillment. Because despite the applause, something still feels empty. Nietzsche knew this feeling. He called it nihilism, the condition in which life loses its inherent value, and all meaning becomes performative. He didn't see this as weakness. He saw it as a symptom of a culture cut off from its soul. And today, that cultural sickness has reached a fever pitch. We are more connected than ever, yet feel more isolated. We share more, but reveal less. We are seen, but rarely understood. The dilemma for the modern woman isn't whether she can have power, it's whether she can have it without losing the parts of herself that crave softness, love, family, spirituality, and community. It's whether she can be seen as fully human, not just a brand or a persona. And it's not just women. Men, too, are caught in this spiral. taught to pursue status, suppress emotion, and treat relationships as accessories rather than anchors. The gender war is not the cause. It is the effect of two lost polarities, each blaming the other for what they've forgotten in themselves. But there is another way. It begins with asking hard questions, not political ones, psychological ones. Do you truly feel whole? Or are you performing an idea of what wholeness should look like? Are your relationships spaces of honesty or negotiations of power? Are you chasing freedom or avoiding intimacy? Nietzsche never gave simple answers, but he demanded that we look inward, that we examine our drives, our values, and our assumptions. He didn't want us to retreat from the world. He wanted us to create a new one, not through domination, but through authenticity. So the question isn't whether modern women are empowered. It's whether empowerment, as we currently define it, is even what the soul truly longs for. Real strength is not the absence of need. It is the courage to be seen in your need. Real freedom is not the rejection of love. It is the ability to love without losing yourself. In a world addicted to appearances, Nietzsche called us to confront the truth. And maybe the truth is this: power without connection is poverty in disguise. The modern dilemma is not that we want too much. It's that we settle for too little. Status over sincerity, control over connection, dominance over depth. The future doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to the whole, to those who can rise without forgetting how to feel, to those who can lead without losing the ability to love. In revenge and in love, woman is more barbarous than man. Nietzsche wasn't taking a jab at women. He was revealing something far more disturbing, something that pierced through the illusions of affection, power, and society's polished veneers. What Nietzsche feared wasn't heartbreak. It wasn't betrayal or lust or even loneliness. It was the death of love itself. Not romance, not sentimentality, but love as a state of being. Love as a metaphysical rebellion against the gravity of ego. Love as the one force in human life that could not be reduced to utility or absorbed by power. In a world increasingly mechanized, commodified, and obsessed with control, Nietzsche saw love being stripped of its divinity, not because people stopped feeling, but because they started calculating. When affection becomes strategic, when kindness becomes branding, when intimacy is leveraged for influence, love dies, quietly, without protest, and most of us never notice until we're already starving. Power, in its self-referential form, always kills love. It demands control, and control can never coexist with true understanding. Love, in its rawest form, requires surrender. It asks us to step outside the boundaries of the self, not to win, not to impress, but simply to be. But power recoils at such humility. It scoffs at vulnerability, and in doing so, it sterilizes what makes us human. Nietzsche warned us. He saw the trajectory. A world driven by power will ultimately forsake love, not because it's inconvenient, but because love cannot be dominated. It cannot be institutionalized. It cannot be owned. And in a world obsessed with ownership of land, of ideas, of people, love becomes a threat. Nowhere is this more evident than in the modern obsession with self-optimization. We chase productivity like salvation. We wake up with our dopamine hacks and time-blocked calendars, training ourselves to see life not as a poem to be lived, but as a project to be managed. We analyze our relationships like KPIs. We evaluate our friends based on network value. We sacrifice presence for performance, and in the process, we hollow ourselves out. Think of the lovers who once dreamed together, but slowly drift apart, not because they stopped caring, but because ambition whispered that success mattered more. Think of the mother who replaces her child's laughter with curated photos and influencer deals, turning moments of connection into content. Think of a society that praises the relentless over the compassionate, the powerful over the present, the profitable over the poetic. We didn't stop loving, we just replaced it. Replaced it with conquest, with utility, with calculation. But Nietzsche saw where that road ends. When love dies, meaning decays. And when meaning decays, all that remains is the will to nothingness, a desperate clinging to motion for motion's sake. We become haunted by the fear of stillness, because in stillness, we must confront what we've lost. The tragedy is not just individual, it is collective. A civilization that no longer honors love begins to fragment. Social bonds become transactional. Marriages become contracts of convenience. Friendships become performance metrics. Families disintegrate under the pressure of image. We are more connected than ever before, and yet we feel more alone, not because we lack affection, but because we have forgotten how to surrender to it. Nietzsche believed that when a society loses its capacity to love, it loses its future. Love, after all, is not weakness. It is the only force that transcends power. It is the only state where the ego dissolves not into despair, but into unity. Love is the rebellion against separation. It is the refusal to see others as objects to be used. It is the only moment when a human being becomes more than a survival machine. But our institutions are not built for love. Our algorithms are not built for love. Our politics, our economies, our entertainment, they feed on division, dopamine, domination. Love does not trend. It does not scale. It cannot be monetized. And so, it is exiled, slowly, subtly, until all that remains is the echo of what once was. The final prophecy of Nietzsche was not just about love. It was about what happens when we kill it, when we trade compassion for conquest, when we sacrifice depth for dominance, when we abandon the courage it takes to open ourselves, not to impress but to understand. He saw the consequences, a species driven by will, yet empty of wonder, a civilization building towers of progress with no foundation of presence, a world that moves faster and feels less. And yet, Nietzsche was not without hope. His warnings were not commands. They were calls to awaken from the trance of ego, to rediscover the courage to love without needing to win, to stand against the tide of manipulation, of ideology, of reductionism, and say, I will not treat this person as a means to an end. I will not commodify connection. I will not outsource meaning to metrics, because love, in its purest form, is the only act of defiance that can redeem us. It is the refusal to surrender our humanity to the cold logic of power. It is the fire that cannot be programmed, predicted, or possessed. It is the last real miracle in a world that has explained everything else away. In the end, the war on love is not fought with weapons. It is fought with habits, with choices, with the small decisions we make each day. To listen rather than dominate, to understand rather than manipulate, to show up rather than perform. Nietzsche's final prophecy wasn't that we would lose love. It was that we would forget what it even meant. And yet, here you are, still listening, still searching, still remembering. And that, maybe, is where the war ends. The question hangs in the air, like a fragile thread stretched across a chasm. Is there a path back to depth? Can a world so obsessed with power find a way to reclaim love without losing strength? Can love and power coexist, or are they forever locked in an existential war, each canceling the other out? Nietzsche, who understood the complexity of human nature more deeply than most, never handed us tidy answers. He offered provocations, sharp, unsettling, refusing to be simplified. To him, life was a constant tension, a dance between creation and destruction, between the will to power and the longing for meaning. The question of redemption, if redemption even exists, was left open, a challenge for each of us to confront within ourselves. To explore this tension, we must look beyond Nietzsche's stark warnings and into the minds of thinkers who dared to imagine integration rather than domination. They offer a glimmer of hope in a world teetering on nihilism. Carl Jung, the great architect of the human psyche, believed that wholeness could only be achieved through the reconciliation of opposites. He called it individuation, the process by which we integrate the fragmented parts of ourselves, the light and the shadow, the strength and the vulnerability. Jung argued that power without love is tyranny, and love without power is helplessness. Only when both are acknowledged and harmonized can we become truly whole. Erich Fromm, a psychologist who devoted his life to understanding human freedom, echoed this idea. He argued that mature love requires strength, not dominance, but the strength to be vulnerable, to care, and to create. Fromm believed love was an art that demanded discipline, courage, and patience. It is not a weakness to surrender to love. It is an act of ultimate power, the power to transform both self and other. Simone de Beauvoir, the existentialist and feminist, challenged traditional roles and power dynamics with a radical vision of freedom. She insisted that true freedom, both for men and women, could only be found in mutual recognition, a balance between autonomy and connection. For de Beauvoir, surrender was not submission. It was a courageous act of trust and authenticity. It was through this balance that individuals could transcend the isolating prison of ego and achieve genuine intimacy. These thinkers, separated by time but united in insight, point us toward a path that is neither domination nor nihilism, but integration. a path where love does not weaken power, but tempers it, where power does not crush love, but supports it. It is a difficult balance, one that demands constant vigilance and self-awareness, because the pull toward control, toward using others as means to an end, is relentless. Imagine a society where this integration is more than theory, where love is not a luxury or an afterthought, but a foundational value woven into our politics, our workplaces, our families, where strength is measured not by dominance, but by the capacity to nurture, to listen, to be present, where power is wielded with humility, aware that true influence grows from connection, not coercion. What would it mean for a CEO to lead, not from fear but from empathy, for a parent to teach not through control, but through presence, for individuals to pursue success not as a means to outshine others, but as a way to enrich themselves and their communities? This is not naive idealism. It is a radical, urgent necessity if we are to survive the crisis of meaning that threatens to engulf us. The road back to depth requires us to confront our own shadows, the parts of ourselves that crave control, that fear vulnerability, that equate power with worth. It demands the courage to say no to the seductive illusions of mastery that promise security but deliver isolation. It calls us to embrace paradox, to be strong yet tender, ambitious yet humble, powerful yet loving. This is the challenge of our time, not because it is easy, but because it is essential. In this moment, consider the image of a woman in a high-rise office. Late at night, she closes her laptop after a long day of meetings, strategies, and decisions. Alone, she steps out into the cool night air, the city's pulse still alive around her. She walks away from the clamor of control, into the quiet space where presence begins. There is no fanfare, no applause, only the simple, profound act of being. Her walk is a metaphor. Power can be taken, seized, lost, and corrupted. But love must be given. It cannot be demanded or enforced. It is the gift that sustains us beyond ambition, beyond achievement. The possibility of redemption lies in that gift, in the willingness to give love, even when the world tells us to harden our hearts, to choose connection over conquest, to find meaning not in domination, but in depth. This is the war no one talks about, the war within ourselves, to reclaim what power tried to erase, to remember that the greatest strength is not in controlling others, but in surrendering enough to truly know them and ourselves. In this surrender, paradoxically, lies the ultimate power. And so, the question is not whether love and power can coexist. The question is whether we have the courage to hold both, to live both, to become both. Because the war on love is not just external, it is within every one of us. And the path back to depth begins with a single step, a decision to stop sacrificing presence for performance, connection for control, love for power. We may not have all the answers. Nietzsche never claimed we would, but in asking these questions, in wrestling with these truths, we open the door to a future where redemption is possible, not as a distant ideal, but as a lived reality. Power can be taken, love must be given, and in that giving, we find not weakness, but the truest form of strength.